We're good? We're good? Okay, thank you. Welcome to the Canadian Whiskey Masterclass. Nice size audience, a little bit bigger than last year, which is good to see that the excitement is growing around Canadian whiskey. I'm going to hope to talk to you a little bit more from a different style than most speakers. This is going to be a little bit technical. That's my background, and we should have a lot of fun today. A little bit about myself. I'm Don Livermore. I'm the master blender for Hiram Walker's Distillery, which is located in Windsor, Ontario. If you look at a map of North America, we are right across from the city of Detroit, the most southerly part of Canada, and I've been the master blender there now for 23 years. I actually started out as their microbiologist, and the company has been fantastic to me. They've actually spent 100% of their money. They sent me to school where I did a Master's of Science in Brewing and Distilling. I did that at Heriot-Watt University. I'm a sucker for education. I continued on with my studies, and I completed a PhD in brewing and distilling. So one of very few master blenders in the world that certainly has that credentials in behind them. But this is something I certainly will use in my everyday job, and this is what I wanted to bring to the table today to talk about what you have in front of you. So each of you in front of you should have a whiskey wheel. A number of years ago, I got asked by our Canadian government to put together a whiskey wheel. Well, I looked at the ones that were online, and I said, man, this isn't really what I envision what a whiskey wheel should be. I just felt as though it was more from like a sommelier's point of view, whereas I wanted to bring a little bit more of a technicality to what we are doing and how I think on an everyday basis. If you look at this wheel in front of you, you'll see the center of the wheel, and you'll see yeast, grain, and wood. Those are the three places where flavor comes from in whiskey. Those are the things that I can manipulate in the whiskey. For example, I can change the grain. That's the first ring of the wheel. We can use some malt, corn, rye, or barley inside a Canadian whiskey. Likewise with the cask. I can burn the cask a certain way. I can finish it in certain types of barrels, or I can age out the whiskey to give a certain type of flavor to your whiskey. The third thing is yeast. That's the brewing. We make beer first, and I'll talk about that here shortly, where we can manipulate yeast to make certain flavors, and you get that green grass, fruity, floral, soapy, and sulfur notes from that. The third ring of the wheel is what we traditionally will see in a flavor wheel. Those are your descriptors: spicy, smoky, vanilla, caramel, toffee. But I really wanted to bring in the technicality to this, and the outside ring of this wheel is the chemical compound that I look for in whiskeys to make your flavor. So for example, if you taste a banana note in my whiskey, it's isoamyl acetate, yeast has made it. Likewise, if you see the vanilla on the outside of the cask ring of the wheel, that comes from the barrel. This is a clever way of putting together a whiskey wheel that's utilizable to you guys out there to understand what we think about as blenders. So how do we put that to use? This is our distillery here. This is where we bring in our grain. You have some pictures up here of our grain silos. At our distillery, we are the largest beverage distillery in North America. Most people would assume that America would have the largest distillery, but it is indeed Canada. It is indeed Canada. And we, on a given year, will bring in about 100,000 metric tons. A metric ton is 1,000 kilos of grain each year. And we will bring in corn, wheat, rye, and barley, and we will do a number of tests on the corn that certainly come in from the whiskeys as well. We'll look for the heat damage, we'll look for moisture content, we'll look for a number of different tests that we do. But I'll tell you this, the most important test that is done at our distillery is right at the front. We have a young lady that works at our grain elevator. Her name is Christy. And Christy physically picks up the grain and smells it. She has the right to reject the grain based on smell. And what she's looking for is a compound called geosmin. If you see on my whiskey wheel under the grain section, you'll see a spoilage. I had to put that on there. But what she's looking for is like a dirty book, or an old book, a dirty basement. Sometimes I call it baseball diamond dirt. If she smells that in the grains coming in, she rejects it. I've seen her do it. They'll send them on their way. Don't worry. If you have musty smelling grain, the fuel alcohol plant up the road will take it. Your car doesn't care about musty smelling alcohol. Okay? The other thing is what Canadian whiskey is known for, and it's the DNA to Canadian whiskey is rye. Rye is very big and bold. We actually get a lot of our rye from the north shore of Lake Erie. If you understand the Canadian geography, Lake Erie is the most southerly Great Lake, and we get a lot of wind there. So it is very sandy soil, and that is the tobacco. No, I didn't do that. That's coming to Canada, but yes. Yeah, it's the tobacco region of Canada. When the tobacco is harvested, they need to plant a cover crop to prevent soil erosion, so they plant rye. Rye is a type of grain that'll grow in very poor conditions. That's why it's native to Canada, and that's why it's a grain that we choose to use inside of our processes today. Now, here's the grains, and when I think about making whiskey, this is what it is. So if I choose to use corn, it gives you a sweet. Now, that's why bourbon is sweet in your whiskey, right? If I use barley, and I'm certainly, you've had some single malts here today or some Irish whiskey, it gives a distinctive nutty character to your whiskey. If you use rye, it's that spiciness, that clove, that ginger. And if you use wheat, it's that nice bread pastry note that brings to whiskey. So these are the things I can use in my toolbox to be able to do this. And for us as Canadians, we'll ferment each of them separately, distill them separately, age them separately, and we put them together at the end. That's why there's a job like mine as a master blender. We'll combine each of those things at the end. Now, this is a difficult slide to actually see in the sunshine and behind you, but why rye? Why do we choose to use rye in our whiskey? Most people in the audiences will say, because that's what grows in Canada, and it's native to Canada. Yes, but there's another reason to it. If you look at the grain rye, I want you to specifically think about the grain kernel rye. The outside kernel is made of fiber, the shell. And if you actually look at the shell of the whisk it's fiber, and fiber is made up of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Sometimes I visualize a brick wall. Cellulose and hemicellulose are the bricks. Lignin is the cement. So if you look at this slide here, the green and the black, that's the hemicellulose and cellulose, and the red is lignin that wraps it all together. Why is that important? If you look at each of the grains, I know it's difficult to read, corn, rye, wheat, and barley, by far, rye has the highest amount of lignin. Rye has a lot of cement. So what? Why is that important? Well, there's lignin, very big molecule. As if anyone's ever visited a distillery, does anyone know what the temperature is inside of a distillery if they visited one? Very hot, right? We're always heating, we're always cooking, we're always boiling stuff, right? So what that happens is you actually bust apart the molecule of lignin. And if you can actually see here, you can see the individual building blocks that lignin would normally look like. So we've just busted it apart. This is where I say to people, that's where your spiciness comes from. Don't ask me how much rye is in my whiskey. You should be asking me how much 4-ethylguaiacol is in my whiskey. It's part of lignin, and that's what we're looking for with rye. Rye has a lot of it, and that's why rye tends to be more spicy than other grains. For you guys to really think about in this audience here, anybody like peated Scotch? Yeah? What is peat? What was peat? It's cool, yeah. It's a low-grade plant material, right? So the plant sits under the ground for 1,000 years. What do you think is degraded? It's the lignin. That's why Scotch is smoky. I always say, I want a T-shirt that says this. Lignin's the world's most unappreciated molecule. That's where a lot of your food flavors actually come from, is the busting apart of fiber in all the vegetation of vegetables that we eat. That's why it's very important to rye. Now, I want to give an example of that. We're going to taste whiskey number 1. This is the brand Lot 40. Lot 40 is 100% rye, aged in brand new virgin oak barrels, and it is column and pot distilled. I'm going to get into that in a minute, why that's important. But this is going to be one of the most intense rye whiskeys that you'll have. And I wanted to bring an example how that spicy flavor certainly comes out into your whiskey. Nosing it, you should get nice floral notes. You should get nice fruity notes. And certainly the spiciness should come through. Because of new oak, you're going to get the nice vanilla, caramel, toffee notes as well. Cheers. Very big, very bold, very spicy. You can see sometimes when I put on my tasting notes up here, I put length of finish. It says 2 minutes. That's not the time it takes to finish a bottle. That's how long do you feel it after. The more rye that is in your whiskey, the longer it's going to be in your chest. We like to call that the Canadian hug. We're very friendly in Canada. Now, the power of this whiskey wheel and why it's very important. I can take this, lay it over exactly what you see in front of you, and I can show you a picture of what my whiskey tastes like. Because of Lot 40, it is column and pot distilled. It's all new American oak, but you can see the rye is a lot of cask influence, certainly a lot of fruity notes to it. This is why this flavor wheel should be used as an example for all whiskeys, so consumers can understand what whiskey they're going to be purchasing or buying. Are we clear? Good, good. Moving on. Fermentation. Fermentation is the heartbeat of the distillery. If fermentation does not go right, then you're going to run into problems. For us, I simply just wanted to stress the point here. We separate our grains. Here's a corn fermentation here. Here's rye fermentation here. Here's some yeast cells. Yeah, I'm geeking out here because I'm a scientist. But for our corn fermentations, we will ferment up to 16% alcohol. Our record is 17% alcohol in our fermentations. If somebody wants to know how we can get that high, I'll talk to you after. I'll give you my card. But we're probably the highest strength of alcohol fermentation that I've seen in a beverage distillery in the world. All right? Our rye fermentations, we don't play with it too much because it's our flavoring ingredient here. We get about to 8% alcohol is what we're kind of targeting. But when yeast eats sugar, what does it make? Most people in the audience, oh, alcohol, that's why we're here. Carbon dioxide, right? It bubbles. Yeah, if anybody makes their own beer at home or wine at home, yeah, it bubbles. But I'm going to give you a little secret. There's one more thing. Yeast makes fruity, floral, green grass, soapy sulfur. Have you ever had a skunky tasting beer or skunky wine before? That's the sulfur the yeast has made. We as brewers can control that, right? I will give you these slides. If you take my card after, I will send them to you. I promise I will. But here are the different things what we can do. We can change the oxygen level or the time of fermentation. We can change the temperature of the fermentation or the pH of the fermentation or the nitrogen level of the fermentation. We can convince the yeast to make any one or more or less of those fruity, floral, green grass, soapy, sulfur notes. That's what beer people do. We do that as distillers as well. It's the heartbeat of your flavor when you're making whiskey. I can't stress it enough to talk about how important yeast is on making whiskey, and it doesn't give it enough due in most presentations. The next step, distillation. I'm sure if you sat in a master class, somebody will throw some stills at you, but I want to simplify it for you here. We will column distill first. So here's a big column. If you can imagine, it's 65 feet tall. It's 6 feet in diameter, 6 feet round. Inside of it are trays. We got about 55 trays. A tray circle the entire column, and in a tray are holes about the size of a two euro piece. All right? And you can see it here if you can see that. So what happens is we take that mash, we dump it down the top. It will fall all the way through the holes to the bottom. At the bottom, you add steam. Alcohol's boiling point is 78 degrees Celsius. Water's boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. So all the alcohol is going to be driven out the top. We collect it as a vapor. We make 70% alcohol. The dead yeast cells the grain. The water will go out the bottom. Forget all that. This is what you have to know. This is how bourbon is made, by the way. One pass through a column still. You keep the grain flavor you're using. You keep the fruity, the floral, the green grass, the soapy notes the yeast has made. Which one did I miss? If you're paying attention. The sulfur note. The sulfur note, yeah. Where'd it go? It didn't go at the top or we'd have skunky whiskey. So where did it go? Bottom. I heard somebody say the bottom. No, it doesn't go at the bottom either. I heard you about, yeah. Copper. If you look at this, is supposed to be a nice shiny copper tray. You'll see a white residue on it. It's called copper sulfate. Copper has the ability to salt out sulfur. I'm going to let you on a little secret. Marketing loves to put this on a bottle. Copper distilled, copper pot distilled, copper, 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 because copper's a sexy word. We all use copper, we have for 10 centuries, for the purpose of salting out the sulfur in the whiskey. Is that clear? We can age that. But there's another method of distillation in Canadian whiskey, and it's similar to the grain whiskey style of blended scotches. We can take that 70% alcohol that went through our first still, we can distill it again through another column still. I can get up to 94% alcohol on that. I can make it from corn, wheat, rye, or barley, and you can't tell the difference. If I double distill through 2 column stills, it makes light, smooth whiskey. That's most Canadian whiskeys made that way. There's a competitor of mine in Western Canada that will put on his label 100% rye, and you taste their whiskey. I don't taste the spicy. I don't taste that 4-ethyl glycol. Distilling shapes your whiskey. The question you should be asking is not how much rye is in my whiskey. You should be asking, how was it distilled? Is the more intelligent question. Just be careful when you pick up about, okay, how did you distill it? If somebody says 100% rye. One more method of distillation that we use in Canada. We can pot distill. Pot distill is what you mostly think about. We will distill through that column still first, that 70% alcohol. We'll put it into one of these pot stills here. Pot stills are very simple. It's like boiling tea, boiling soup. You slowly boil it. And this is the slide that most people will take a picture of. When you slowly boil it, the very first things that come off, I'll back myself up a second. What I've put here is all the chemical compounds that either comes from yeast or from the grain, and I put it in their boiling point order. And when you slowly boil a pot still, the very first things that come off is the green grass flavors. You take that, you cut it, you throw it away. Because nobody likes that raw character. You boil it some more. What comes next? Your cherry, your banana, pear, strawberry, apple, apricot, roses, lilacs, spicy, 4-ethyl glycol. What's left after distillation after 12 hours is the soapy flavors in your. We stop the distillation and throw it away. That's your tails. So the next time you try a scotch out there that has a soapiness to it or a waxiness to it, how long they let the pot still go on for? Do they intentionally want that in there, or is it a little bit of economics involved? I stop our distillation. I don't want that soapiness in it. So actually, by column and pot distilling, you can actually concentrate up fruity, floral, and spicy characters, and that's how Lot 40 is made. Pot stills shape your whiskey. Next slide. All right, whiskey number 2. You guys have a real treat. I have people in Canada that's got me on my Instagram account right now, and you guys are trying something before they can try it. Only 300 cases of this is made. This is cast strength Lot 40. And I have people will be lining up in about 3 weeks from now, and they'll buy every bottle in Canada, and you guys have a privilege of tasting this today. So this is 57% alcohol. What we've done is column and pot distillate, 100% rye. I did one extra step with a cast strength Lot 40 for this year, as I took it out of those new American oak casks and put it into French oak casks. So what that's going to do is you're going to drive up, to take a picture, you're going to be driving up more of this flavor in the whiskey in comparison to the first one we had. Cheers. Big, bold, spicy, warm. That's 57% ABV. When I'm blending whiskey, I'm thinking about how much vanilla versus how much spice, and those French oak casks certainly will give you a really boosted vanilla note to your whiskey. We good? All right, just enjoy that for a few minutes, and I'll talk about aging whiskey. Barrels, of course, we burn them. And I like this slide here because I put this up, and I had this discussion with a person earlier today. Do you know between American oak and French oak, they cut them differently? Here's European oak. They cut 3-foot logs for the staves. European oak, they'll cut on the diagonal. With American oak, they'll cut them at 90 degrees. But whether it's coming from America or coming from Europe, it doesn't matter. We're still after the same thing. Just like the grain rye, we're still looking for the same thing. It's fiber. Wood is 100% fiber. So it's made of that cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Remember, cellulose and hemicellulose is the bricks, and lignin is the cement. When we have a barrel, what's the best way to break apart wood? What's the best way to break apart wood? Did I hear somebody say axe? I hope not. That's a lot of effort. Burn it. You burn it. So there's lignin again. This is where you burn it, you break it down into its building blocks. This is where your sweet, smoky, your clove comes from, your vanilla comes from the lignin part of the wood. Likewise, when I burn cellulose and hemicellulose, that's where your caramel and toffee notes come from. I'm going to give you my PhD up here. You didn't think you'd come for a PhD dissertation today? Well, you did. Let's say I want as much vanilla, caramel, toffee as I can possibly get. Is more fire good or more fire bad? I want as much vanilla. And we can buy barrels based on 1 millimeter of char to 7 millimeters of char. So that's more fire. If I want vanilla, what do you think would be the best barrel to buy? Everyone. You're guessing? Okay. Most people will say more fire is good, right? You're going to burn it, break it apart more. Here's my PhD here. This is 3 years of aging along the bottom. This is your vanilla caramel toffee. This is a 2 millimeter burn, new wood. That's a 4 millimeter burn. You can't overburn your barrel. I misled you on the previous slide. I should have one more arrow. The more you burn creates carbon, the black. And the only thing the black is good for is to pull out whatever sulfur note. A lot of the bourbon producers will buy a 4 millimeter burn because they only have one shot at the copper contact when they distill their whiskey. So they can pull out sulfur by buying that. But when I make lot 40, I want a 2 millimeter char. In Canadian whiskey, we can buy barrels. Here's a once used bourbon barrel, and there's a barrel that's been used over and over and over again. Alcohol is a good solvent. Actually, it keeps picking away, keeps picking away, keeps picking away at the barrel. You'll always get something. I never say a barrel goes dead. You always will get something in your whiskey. The last part I want to talk about is where we're located. Windsor, Ontario, in southern Ontario, is one of the more unique places in the world that makes your whiskey. It's because of our temperature change. The Great Lakes, we will get very hot and humid in the summertime. Extraordinarily hot. But in the winter, we will get freezing cold because of the lakes. We're actually Canada's thunderstorm capital of Canada. We get 29 thunderstorms a year. And here's our whiskey aging warehouses here. We have 1.6 million barrels on site. It's the size of 132 ice hockey arenas. I'm a Canadian, so I got to say that. 132. That's a lot of barrels. And inside the warehouses, it's not temperature controlled. So whatever the outside temperature is, that's what the barrels are going to be. I measured lot 40, the one you just had, last February. It was -5. The liquid inside the barrel was -5 degrees Celsius. But I measured it in July. It got up to 25 degrees Celsius. Causes those barrels to expand and contract and causes those barrels to breathe. And that's what we're looking for. In fact, we lose 3% a year to evaporation. Incidentally enough, 1.6 million barrels. What's 3% of 1.6 million? We lose 48,000 barrels a year to the angel share. Our distillery works 6 weeks for free. It's a crazy thought. But we find it's an important reaction. So when it comes to burning barrels, there's the last part in a barrel I'll talk about, it was tannins. You can't smell tannin. If you're doing whiskey notes, you can't smell it. It's odorless. If you taste tea in your whiskey, like black tea, that's tannin. And these are what the molecules look like of that. So we burn it. It breaks it down into a mixture of acids. And what that mixture of acids will do is will react with oxygen. Again, I'll share those slides with you. I know it's very quick chemistry. But at the end of the day, when oxygen combines with those acids that came from the tannins, it will make a green apple note in your whiskey. It's actually acetaldehyde and ethyl acetate. And here are my slides here on those two compounds, acetaldehyde and ethyl acetate. This is 20 years of aging. That's the parts per million. It just keeps going and going and going in time. There is a terroir to whiskey. We make 10 parts per million of ethyl acetate a year in our whiskey. If I was in India or Jamaica, I actually talked to our guys, friends from Jamaica, they lose 15%. They would make way more than me in a year. Likewise, in Scotland or Ireland, they'd be about half of what we're doing. That's why there's different ages will be a different perception to whiskey. Myself, personally, I like bourbons, kind of the 8 to 12 range. I like Canadian whiskey, 15 to 18 range. And I like my scotches, 18 to 25. But it's because of the terroir to whiskey. I wanted to bring you with the last treats. I'm not even sure whether the Weiser's 18 years is available in France. No, so this is a treat for you. If you want to taste, well, I almost call it the taste of angel share. If you want to taste what an ethyl acetate tastes like in that green apple, this is a great example of a whiskey. This whiskey has been double distilled through 2 column stills, so it makes light whiskey. It's made from 100% corn, and it sits in a used Canadian whiskey barrel for 18 years. And this really shines in terms of the green apple. And you can see, even here, you got 0 rye, nothing here. The majority of the taste you're going to taste in this whiskey is the taste of age. Cheers. If you notice when you're tasting this one, you're not getting a lot of that through the chest because there's no rye in this one. It's more on the top of your tongue to the top of your mouth. Totally different, very light, very smooth, and this is a great example of what a traditional Canadian whiskey is. I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories to tell. I made a couple of mistakes in my lifetime. Mistake number 1, and usually Canadians or North Americans will get this joke, but mistake number 1, I was in Winnipeg in February. That's like being in Siberia in February. Why would you go there? It's minus 50. It's very, very cold. But Winnipeggers, that's when they have their annual Whiskey Fest. They have nothing better to do on a cold winter day when the snow's on the ground than to have a Whiskey Fest. And you guys obviously are here. You know what Whiskey Fests are like. I like to participate in Whiskey Fests myself. And I was going around that night trying whiskey, and I was having a good time, introducing myself to people that like me. And I got asked to go on television, the news, 6:45 in the morning following the Whiskey Fest. So 6:45 tomorrow. Anyone want to go on TV? No, I'm saying no, we don't. I had to, okay, because I do the public relations. And I was on TV with our Jameson ambassador and our Glenlivet ambassador. So Irish whiskey and Scotch, 4 minutes, television. My mistake really wasn't, because little cobwebs. My mistake was, before you go on live broadcasts, you should always ask the question you're going to be asked, right? I didn't that morning. I didn't. And I said, I can suck anything whiskey. I was unprepared for this question. What makes Canadian whiskey better than Scotch or Irish whiskey? That's a loaded question for people in our industry, because Scotch and Irish, they're fantastic products. And I'm sitting in okay, how do I answer that question? Oh my gosh. And it came to me in that moment. And I answered it like this. I believe Canadian whiskey is the most innovative, creative, adaptable style of whiskey there is. All we have to do is be made of grain, fermented, aged, and distilled in Canada, aged in a wooden barrel of less than 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years and a minimum of 40% alcohol. That's it. They don't tell me I have to use a mash bill like bourbon. They don't tell me how to distill it. I can use column stills, pot stills, whatever I want. And I can use whatever barrel type I want to use. That makes Canadian whiskey diverse. Isn't that Canada? And that's how I answered that question. I sincerely believe that today I wouldn't want to be a master blender anywhere else than in the Canadian whiskey category. There's lots of latitude. You see that whiskey wheel. That's what I think about at nighttime. There's so many different ways and directions I can go in making whiskey. You had 3 different whiskeys here today. 2 of them you can tell from the same distillery, but the third one, you couldn't tell. And that's what makes it fun to be a blender. I'm going to leave my card up here. You can take those whiskey wheels with you. If you want those slides, I'm more than willing to share with them. You got to email me. I won't email you. And thank you very much.